Mitchell, Shadow Foreign Secretary. The Shadow Foreign Secretary was first elected to Parliament in 1987 and took positions in the second major government as a Lord Commissioner for Treasury and as a Minister in the Department of Social Security. In 2001, he was elected to Sutton Coldfield, since when his career has had a strong international focus. He was Secretary of State for International Development between 2010 and 2012, and latterly Minister of State for Development and for Africa between 2022 and 2024, and Deputy Foreign Secretary. He's now the Shadow Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Secretary. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be in conversation with you, Shadow Foreign Secretary. And I think the backdrop to this conversation is that we're living through an era of profound change and challenge in the international arena. And the world is very different to when you entered government in 2010. So 3 facts for me sum this up. At that time, the G7 was the G8 because Russia was still in it. The temperature in 2010 was 0.88 degrees above the pre-industrial average. In 2023, it was 1.46. And finally, that was an era of rising international development budgets. So, a few words on the structure of this session. I'll ask a few questions of the Shadow Foreign Secretary, and then I'll bring in our other guest, Ryan Henson, the CEO of the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and ask you a few questions of them together, and then I'll open up the conversation and bring in the audience. Another heads up before we begin. I'm aware that this is a moment of profound events in the international arena. So as well as those sorts of systemic changes, we've also got the very serious events in the Middle East. We've got the US election coming up. So we will not cover all of that terrain. I'm going to focus in on a few things and then look to you as the audience to bring in some other dimensions. So my particular focus will be your overall take on foreign affairs, and then some of the areas where you've invested the most leadership around development and Africa. So my first question, how do you see this moment in international affairs? Which risks keep you awake at night? And where do you see the UK most beneficially putting its effort in the international arena?
Okay, so it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you for coming to our party conference, and thank you very much for your very kind introduction. It sounded a bit like an obituary, but hopefully not. So I don't think that I can remember any time in my lifetime, or anyone's lifetime in this room, where the world is in such a dangerous place. And the example I'll give you of that is that we have the crisis in Ukraine, where Europe is at war again, and where something which we all thought had been consigned to the history books in the last century has taken place. We have Russia, one of the permanent representatives at the United Nations, invading a sovereign nation, its neighbour, butchering its citizens, and cynically bombing its infrastructure so they can't keep warm in the winter at night. And then we have the position in the Middle East, which, whatever you think, and I spoke last night to CFI and made a speech positioning the party, I hope, in the right place on all of this. But there's clearly a very big crisis there. And the point I would make about that is that from the darkest hour can come progress, and so we must never give up or despair. You know, after the Intifada, we made huge progress and nearly got there at Oslo, and we must lift people's eyes. It's one of the things the British government should be doing with our very strong diplomatic service, to the possibility of progress, noting the Abraham Accords, noticing the possibilities of what can happen. We must lift people's eyes to that. So those are 2 major crises. But then, you know, I don't know how many people in this room know that in Sudan, because of the grotesque behaviour of these 2 generals, one running the SAF and the other the RSF, there is now a position where very poor people are hugely displaced. I went down to the border between Chad and Sudan and saw these women and children streaming across the border in the clothes that they were wearing, no men at all, because they'd either been murdered or they'd gone into hiding. And we face a situation now where this winter, 10 million people in Sudan may starve to death. And it doesn't even make the front page of the newspapers. And I say all this because I'm trying to argue the point that the world is incredibly dangerous at the moment. And I've just been reading Robert Harris's new book about 1914 and Asquith's government. And I do think there are parallels. It was a very hot summer, actually, as well. I do think there are parallels between 1914, before Europe was convulsed in the First World War, and today. It's a very dangerous world. But above all, we've lost the international rules-based system because of the behaviour of Russia. When I came into government, as you said, in 2010, Britain's role in the world was much bigger than it is today. But also, there was identifiably an international rules-based system which had impact. That has been atomised by Russia's behaviour as a member of the UN Security Council and by the growth of narrow nationalism. All these people are narrow nationalists. Modi, Xi, Erdogan, Boris Johnson, Trump. These are narrow nationalists, and we live at a point in this dangerous world where we need the international rules-based system, because the key problems that confront the next generation, climate change, pandemics, migration, these will only be resolved and will only make progress if you have an international system which brings people together. While you've got strong men, and it is mostly men, all the ones I listed are men, while you've got strong men who are narrow nationalists running their countries and an atomised international system, you will not have the will and the oomph to make real progress on those matters. And Britain has done well on climate change. I see today that the last coal-fired power station is going to stop. This is a tremendous tribute, actually, to the 14 years of Conservative government, the progress that was made on energy and so on. But my point about the international rules-based system and the dangers we live in today seem to me to be real issues with which we have to grapple and never give up.
Thank you. I wanted to move on to international development, where you've invested years as a leader in international development policy. Latterly, in your time as Development and African Minister, you sought to ensure that the D in the FCDO didn't get lost behind the wider foreign policy focus, which included a new white paper, for example, on development. So I wanted to ask you, what lessons did you learn through those years about development and about its place in the UK's international policy, and how do you think we're placed now?
So when Rishi asked me to go back to the foreign brother, to my surprise, and see what I could do to help the D, I went back, and to be honest with you, meeting former DFID people was a bit like meeting people who were recovering from a nuclear attack and coming out of the rubble and slightly sort of starry-eyed and amazed by what had happened. And I thought to myself, what a foolish thing to do to get rid of DFID. There's a very powerful case, to say that since Suez, the one area of real acknowledged British leadership internationally was through international development. We dominated the area at the UN and in Geneva. Foreign governments, the Germans, the Australians, the Americans, they used to come to DFID to talk about how they could make their contribution in development and tackling some of these problems which I mentioned. They didn't come to DFID because it was a British government department. They came because it was a coagulation of brilliant people. Suma Chakrabarti, the first permanent secretary, Mark Lowcock, Minouche Shafiq, who's now for Labour doing this review of international development structures. These are very big international characters who could pick up the phone all around the world and the international system and would be listened to with respect. That was what DFID did. And getting rid of DFID, in my view, was a terrible mistake. But my remit at the Foreign Office was not to go around saying it's a terrible mistake, we must have DFID again. It was to see if I could make the system work. And having David Cameron back as Prime Minister, who had championed DFID, was very good, and we did a whole series of things which made it better. There is now a second permanent secretary who is specifically responsible for development. There's a committee between the development minister and the chief secretary of the Treasury designed to ratchet up the effectiveness of development, which is incredibly important because the money must be spent well. And also a new platform, UCDEV, designed to rope in civil society, and the duty, incidentally, on the second permanent secretary to increase support for development by 3% a year over the next 10 years. Because one of the things, my most abject failure among many, was I wanted to try and ensure that we lifted the support in the public for international development. Half of our fellow citizens basically think sending money overseas is a complete waste and should be spent on their hospitals and schools. And the other half, to a greater or lesser degree, believe that international development really matters. I wanted to try and raise it. And to be fair, we did some surveys at a time of acute austerity in Britain under Cameron and Osborne between 2010 and 2012, which showed that because David Cameron championed it, and the government was behind it, and it was a British policy, meant that support went up from about 46% to 50%. Much, much more amongst women, and far, far more amongst those under the age of 30. So, you can make progress on this if you make the argument, but the argument is not being made at the moment. It hasn't been made really since Theresa May ceased to be Prime Minister, and in her election in 2017, the first announcement she made was that the government would stand by the 0.7. And I've never been so proud in my life as being a minister on the day that George Osborne announced that we would, in spite of all the austerity going on in Britain, that we would stand by our commitment to the poorest people in the world and spend the 0.7. It's not about the money, it's about what it says about Britain, what it says about our values. And when I was at the Foreign Office, the money, we found ways of increasing it, quite significant ways of increasing it. But in my view, it wasn't the money, it was the structure that was hobbling us in having that effect. So, I think that since Suez, the one area of undoubted leadership, as we lost an empire, all the rest of it, where we had real respect and real influence and impact around the world, was on development. And that now, to put it at its best, has gone backwards. And there's a real danger too, watch for this budget, because there's a real danger too that Britain is not going to produce the money that the Tories produced for development after we went back to 0.5, because as those of you will know, the first year costs of an asylum seeker is a charge on the budget for development. So £4 billion last year was spent on first year asylum seekers here. That's in accordance with the rules. It's allowed under the rules, and I face the dilemma of, do I go to the Treasury and say, we're going to contest this and you mustn't spend this money in this way, where I thought I would be flattened? Or do we go to the Treasury and say to Jeremy Hunt, who really knows about development, understands, listen, look at this £4 billion, you've got to help us. And he did. He gave us £2.5 billion to soften the blow of that. Now, there is no indication at the moment that Rachel Reeves and the Labour Treasury intend to do the same thing. And if they don't, think of the impact of that. We've managed to rejig the budget so that we have doubled the bilateral programme to some of the poorest countries in the world. You cannot revisit those figures. My officials had to implement 3 lots of cuts. They had to break promises made to the poorest people in the world. They had to tear up contracts and go back on key projects. Very bad value for money for the taxpayer, by the way, very bad value. They've now been given a proper base. They've got the figures for this year and next year. We need to stand by those. If the Treasury don't provide additional funding, as Jeremy Hunt did when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, there is a very, very bleak picture, not only for some of the poorest people in the world, but also for Britain's reputation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce Ryan. Ryan Henson, thank you so much for joining us. Ryan's the CEO of Coalition for Global Prosperity. Prior to joining the coalition, he worked at the Catholic Agency for International Development and on human rights policy in the Ministry of Justice. He's also an associate fellow at Bright Blue, the independent think tank for liberal conservatism. So Ryan, reacting to what you've heard from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, you work on making the case for international development as part of the UK's wider international policy toolkit. Where do you think we are today? And how do you try to convince the sceptics?
Yeah, well, thank you, Laura. It's a privilege to be here and a privilege to sit alongside Andrew. So quickly then on where we are, so don't disagree with anything that Andrew said. What I would add is that I think in policy terms, Andrew has handed over a really good foundation for the current government to build on. So a really good white paper. As Andrew's mentioned, put the D into the FCDO. I'm sure there's still more work to do. The machinery of government is in a good place. So I think there's a couple of areas where we need to look with some concern, and hope, of course, is that the Labour government sorts itself out. One is money, and Andrew's touched on it. And the point I would add to what Andrew said is that if you've got money to renationalise the railways and pay off the unions, to argue that there isn't enough money to do what you want to do on development just simply isn't true. It's a public policy choice. And Labour have a mandate, and they've got plenty of MPs to vote things through. But the idea that there isn't enough money is simply not the case. It's a choice, and I think we should all be very clear about that. In terms of engaging sceptics of international development, I'll just talk briefly about the sceptics at a political level rather than the general public at this point. So first of all, you need to have the absolute courage of your convictions. And Andrew is living proof of this. I've lost count of the number of MPs who've said to me privately, I agree with you, development is really important, but I don't want to talk about it because my constituents don't care. And I've shown them polling to say that, look, you may not win any votes. Andrew's absolutely correct, 50% of the public are not with us, but you're not going to lose any votes either. And I think having the courage to stand up and say, look, constituents, it's easy for me to say because I'm not elected, but look, I know that you don't instinctively support this, but I do, and here's why. And I don't think we've had enough of that with Andrew and others who are obviously honourable exceptions. I think we need to tell the positive story of development. I think too many people that I speak to, including at political level, are influenced too much by the advertising campaigns that I think fortunately now are sort of a thing of the past, but when you put on the TV at Christmas time, there'd be an appeal, and there'd be a poor child who would have flies buzzing around their face. And so people would say, we're giving all this money, and what's changed? Actually, there's a really positive story to tell. That's not to downplay the scale of the challenge that's still left, but we should talk about the wins as well as the defeats. I think we need to link development to national security. If COVID has taught us anything, and this is like a cliche now, but what happens overseas doesn't stay overseas, it comes here too. So we should talk more about that. And finally, the idea that development is isolated, that it's a nice thing to do, that it's something we ought to do, but only if we've got money, is not true. And whenever at CGP we put on events, the room is always filled with people who have served overseas in the armed forces, or people who have served in the diplomatic service. They really get it more than anyone else that I've known. I mean, to paraphrase and butcher the famous quote by Jim Mattis, who was the US Marine General and Defense Secretary under Donald Trump, so hardly a bleeding heart liberal, he said to a congressional hearing, and I'm butchering it, but the gist of it was, the less you spend on aid, the more I have to spend on bullets. And I think we need to make that as clear as possible to as many people as possible.
Thank you so much. I wanted to return to one of the points you made earlier, Charlie Foreign Secretary, because there's a conversation here which is about money, but there's also a conversation here about realities on the ground, and you've spent plenty of time as a minister on the ground, not least in Africa, meeting with ministers, businesses, communities. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about some of those visits, what you saw, and what you'd like the UK to do now. And I was thinking in particular of some of the visits you made this year. So you mentioned Sudan, but also Ethiopia, places where there are active conflicts, and yet they feel still very hidden. What do you want to see the UK doing?
So thank you for that. So first of all, one point I should have mentioned in answer to your first question, but which you just raised again, is the white paper. Now the white paper, I learnt from my very good friend Douglas Alexander, who produced a white paper back in 2009 designed to wrong-foot the Tories. And because it was clearly designed to wrong-foot the Tories, no one read it, sort of pulped, I think. So we wanted to produce a white paper, and I said to the powers that be, it won't work if it's a Tory white paper, because no one will engage, no one will. It's got to be a all-party white paper. It's got to be a British white paper, which is what I've always tried to do with development. Try to get we managed it actually, get the party politics out of it. And that's what we're going to produce. Anyway, after a lot of trouble, we got that agreed, and we did what we thought was right, and we made sure we included the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, even the SNP, I think, to try and make sure that they would sign up to what we wanted to do. And because it was all party, of course, it got the attention of all of Whitehall, not just the people who had to produce it, who were putting in their intellectual input, and all around the world we had 56 countries help us with the white paper, put forward ideas for it. And so when it was produced, if you look, it's endorsed by just 20 heads of state or heads of agencies who endorse it. It is a really good document, I think, and the Labour Party has embraced it. And Keir Starmer made a speech last week where I noticed he was using some of the words from the white paper. And that is really, really good. And of course, within the Foreign Office, it was good too, because the development specialists were able to strut their stuff and have free rein. And the traditional Foreign Office saw what they could do, were rather impressed, and wanted to add in what they could do, and the development people saw the way in which the traditional Foreign Office could help. So the white paper, I hope, will be seen as a core document and will survive, and I'm reasonably sure that it will. Now, you talk about the visit, I'll just mention two. You mentioned Sudan and Ethiopia, so let's focus on those very quickly. If you're dealing with the Eurosceptics and in the dog and duck in Sutton Coldfield, where people continually say, aren't you the bloke who sent all our money to India? I always say to them, the aim of development is to build strong societies over there, so they don't need or want to come over here. And we live in a globalized world where people, in the Sahel, they know that just a few hundred miles away, people are living the life of Riley. We made a very bad mistake in Mali, where the old Diffid people were not listened to. There's the idea you can put a military wrapper around these huge problems where women cannot give birth safely to their children, they cannot get enough food for their children, they cannot send their children to school. You can't put a military wrapper around that, or at the very least you have to invest in development as well as put a military wrapper. There's one voice from Diffid at the National Security Council meeting that took the decision to send troops to support the French operation, which warned of this, swept aside. So it's a big mistake. But that's the aim of development. It is to build strong and secure and hopefully prosperous societies over there, so that people don't need to move. And we conducted some polling outside Syria, another country where half the population was on the move. And the people who were in the camps in Jordan and also living in Lebanon and in Turkey, they didn't want to go to Europe. They wanted to go back. They wanted the fighting to be over, so they go back to the communities from which they've been driven out. So that's an important piece on the board. Now, Sudan is desperate. I did the visit to Chad. I went down to the border. I saw these people. I gave a slightly lachrymose interview to Channel 4, which I slightly regretted as a sort of rather stuffy English public school boy. But anyway, I gave them it. But I've never been so affected by what I saw. I've never seen such a weight of human misery. Weight of, it's very hard to describe, but you could feel coming up from people the scale of the awfulness of their lives every minute of every day. And that situation has not been gripped. It's very difficult because there are too many countries surrounding Sudan who think they have a dog in the fight either way. And what is happening now in Darfur, what's happening in Al-Fasher, this is very serious. George Bush referred to these events in 2003 as a genocide. I don't see any reason to resile today from what George Bush said then, and that confronts us, our consciences as humanity internationally about what is going on there. So it's awful, and I hope that the Jeddah process, which the Americans put a lot of effort into with Saudi Arabia, I hope that it can be revivified and that you can make some progress. And Britain has put a lot of effort into that as well. On Ethiopia, the story is slightly better because at the end of last year, a number of us were incredibly concerned that there was going to be a famine there, and that we would not have learned the lessons of 40 years ago. My friend Bob Geldof, who has extensive connections there, was worried, and if he's worried, we should all be worried. And the UN and the EU both said that they weren't sure that this was the problem. So they said, Andrew, go there and find out. And I went there and I avoided falling out with Abby by saying, I was here to try and help, because he'd thrown out the UN when they had said there was a famine coming the previous year. And I went up to look for myself to the red zone to see what was happening there. And I went to a clinic and I saw the most upsetting things you ever see, which is a whole crowd of little children who are very severely emaciated and who are being checked out. And I went through the sheets, because it's all done in writing, which showed, how these children had been there 3 weeks before and 3 weeks before that, and whether they were getting better. There's this extraordinary piece of equipment which I have on my office in Parliament, where you pull it between a green and a yellow and a red, and if it's in the red zone, it means these children are, very, very, very seriously malnourished. And the chart showed it wasn't really getting better. So armed with that, we then were able, thank God for the Americans and others, to organise a replenishment conference in Geneva, which I co-chaired with the Ethiopian finance minister and the Swiss. And we were able to get replenishments. Britain put in £100 million, the Americans put in the same amount. And we were able to raise £600 million, basically to be spent through 3 different organisations in Ethiopia on food. And these replenishment conferences, they normally raise between 10 and 20%. This raised over 60%. So it was a success, and I think that has stopped there being a famine this year. And I just finished by one tiny story about this, which I went to a wonderful meeting in New York when I was Development Secretary with Bob Geldof, which was a similar sort of replenishment conference. And people announced that they would give money, and the Italian gentleman made a very laudable and noble speech about the importance of giving money, but it became clear that he wasn't going to give any money. And Bob Geldof interrupted him and said, this is all very well, Franco, but how much money are you going to put up? And he looked sort of slightly shifty and continued to drone on. And Bob interrupted him again and said, hey, Franco, put up or shut up. And he went on again. And he said, listen, if you're going to go on like this and make these noble speeches, not going to produce any money, why don't you fuck off? And he left, he picked up his papers and left the room. So everyone else after that pledged money. And at this conference, I listened to the Chinese saying how important it was to produce money. And at the end of it, they didn't produce any money. And there were others similarly, and I tried to summon up my inner Bob Geldof and do the same thing, but I thought I'd better not. But the point is, we got to 60%, and that was a good outcome.
Diplomacy in action. Ryan, how do we convince the public of the need to invest in engaging in these invisible crisis situations?
Well, I think everything that Andrew said is absolutely right. I think migration is something that we don't talk about anywhere near enough, and I would echo some of the examples that Andrew's touched on. I was in Uganda earlier this year with families that have fled from across the border, and they very clearly said to the delegation of parliamentary candidates that I was with, were it not for the aid that I'm receiving here, I would be on my way to Europe, because I have no choice. And I think we don't get that message across nearly enough. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that this isn't just development which is playing victim to this age of populism in which we find ourselves. And so thinking about that and thinking of the people in the dog and duck, the thing that I always think we don't do enough of, and it comes back to this courage of conviction stuff, is I don't think we talk up sufficiently the role of the UK historically and why we have a duty to do what we can to help those who, through no fault of their own, cannot help themselves. I often say to people, we're a member of the G7, seat on the Security Council, the world's, if it's the 6th or 7th largest economy, enough to be getting on with. If we can't do it or won't do it, then who reasonably can? And we've always done this. And we think about when the Germans went into, or the Nazi government went into Poland in the 30s, when there's been crises in Europe since. We didn't shrug our shoulders and say, that's none of our business. When Europe was starving after the Second World War, it was Churchill and the Attlee government who supported Marshall Aid and helped set up the institutions which have kept the world safe to this day. So the idea that our generation should walk away and shrug our shoulders and say, look, things are difficult at home, so we're going to absolve ourselves of this responsibility, should be called out for what it is, a complete dereliction of duty and a disgrace on those who've gone before us. I think this challenge, solving poverty and all the issues which cause it, whether that's conflict, climate change and so on, is the great challenge of our time. And I'm not for a moment downplaying the very real challenges that people face in paying their bills and so on and so forth. But for goodness sake, there should be more politicians like Andrew who are able to make an intelligent, coherent argument for why we should help people while also making sure we're okay at home.
Thank you, Ryan.
Can I just add something? I
Absolutely.
think that's what you said is not the last part, but what you said is absolutely right. And if you think about it, what you said about after the Second World War, you know, America took this country, which was completely flat, Germany, under Nazi rule. It took it and it introduced the Marshall Plan, and it made Germany, gave it the foundations to rebuild. Now imagine if we took exactly the same logic for the Sahel. What an impact that would have on all the key problems, above all migration, if you had the same logic.
Absolutely. Okay, my final question, and a slightly different tack before we open up to the audience. So, Shadow Foreign Secretary, your book, published a few years ago, and very well received, had a very intriguing subtitle, which was Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. So I wondered, what would the establishment lackey position be, the sort of unreformed position, on foreign and development affairs in 2024? And what is it about the received wisdom that you don't agree with or thinks deserves further scrutiny?
What an interesting question. Well, my book is available. I've been signing copies. I've been signing copies this morning at the bookshop, which is very badly located at the conference because it's quite difficult to find. And I think you were very kind about it. I think basically it wasn't a politician pompously delivering his view on, or her view on what you need to do to save the world. It was actually, I tried to make people laugh who read it. And a lot of my colleagues in Parliament bought it, and I said, if it doesn't make you laugh, I'll give you your money back. And none of them so far have asked for their money back. So thank you for the advert. I mean, no, I couldn't possibly argue that I wasn't a member of the establishment. You know, I'm an English, public school, Oxbridge, former soldier, former banker. You know, so I wouldn't insult your intelligence by saying I wasn't a member of the establishment. But some years ago, things happened in my life which made me rather disillusioned about the establishment, and many of you may remember, but I never think about them now, because if I think about them, I would become angry, and it's much better in life to move on and go for the positives. But I think that it is right for us all to exercise rigorous analysis. When the establishment, Harold Miller once said, if the establishment all agree on something, it's almost certainly wrong. And I think that it is right to be sceptical, you know. And I hear people saying, "Oh, well, the British system of justice, or the British criminal justice system, or the British police, or whatever, is the best in the world." And I always say to myself, "Well, hang on a minute. Are we just being sort of rather conceited and pompous? Should we not be a bit reflective on the fact that our prisons are overflowing at the moment, on the fact that not a day goes by without people in the police being charged? At least they are being charged or investigated. Should we not, you know, be a little bit more humble and sceptical and not believe automatically that to be born British or to be born English is to win first prize in God's lottery?"
Thank you. Ryan, if I ask you to put your iconoclast hat on, which aspects of the received wisdom would you challenge?
Well, I was struck by the word establishment, so slightly take it down that angle. I declare an interest as a Social Mobility Commissioner, but the Social Mobility Commission did some research about 8 years ago which showed that the old Department for International Development was the least diverse when it comes to staff and socio-economic background of all of Whitehall. So what that basically meant was that you are more likely to be middle class at DFID than you were anywhere else in government at that time. And I think this underlines the point that we've discussed here this afternoon, which is these conversations have to be had in areas where at the moment there is real deep-rooted scepticism for international development. So I'd like to shake up that aspect of the establishment. I'd like kids from poorer backgrounds to experience the gap year opportunity that so many of us may have enjoyed, which have perhaps in some cases led to careers or passion for international development.
Yes.
I think that helps win the argument, and it's good for the countries that we're going to too, because they see a different side of the UK and not just middle class people from London.
And that was what the International Citizen Service, which David Cameron and I set up, did. And I remember David and I going to meet 6 of the people who'd done it, who came from places like Bradford, and for whom it had been a real experience. And these people reduced David and me to tears by saying what it had meant for them, what they got from it, and what they'd given from it as well. It was extraordinary, and we've set it up again. It's supposed to be happening now, I think. So hopefully the ICS will be reborn.
Thank you. Okay, let's open up to the audience. Fantastic. Okay, there's one here, and then behind, and then in the corner. Thanks.
Charlie Secretary, I'm from Malaria No More UK, an issue which I know that you've championed for many years and very successfully so in government. Malaria, as you know, is a disease which disproportionately affects women and children under 5, and in fact it still kills a child every minute. It is also a deep disease which is completely preventable and treatable. With the right investment, this is a disease that can be ended in our lifetimes, but we're yet to fully understand what the new government's priorities on these issues are going to be. What do you think the Conservative opposition's role and ability to hold the government's feet to the fire and retain this as a UK government's priority is and can be?
Well, malaria. Sorry.
Do you want to answer?
I think so, because you've got that
Go
for it. So, first of all, Malaria No More is a great organisation. The president of Rwanda for CHOGM thought it very important to prioritise it. That's very important too. And you're right. And of course, what you say fits in very well, I think, with my earlier theme that if you want to combat climate change, you need a strong international system. Now, I went with the Global Fund to an African country and discovered to my horror that having had years of malaria elimination, malaria had now turned. Why had it turned? Because heavy rain, climate change, puddles of water, larvae for mosquitoes. And I and Peter Sands, the head of the Global Fund, we togged up and we sprayed these houses. And I was quite keen to continue doing it because it's quite satisfying to spray all these houses and they keep the mosquitoes out and the children are safe when they sleep. But there is a real challenge there that far from eliminating it, you may go backwards because of particularly climate change and other factors as well. On the other hand, we have made progress. Britain invented the vaccine. There's a lot of work going on that. Thanks to the Gates Foundation, there's been a huge amount of work on making sure these nets really count. They're very cheap, and we've now stopped them being used as fishing nets rather than malaria nets. So all of that is good. There's a balance sheet. But the point is that a commitment to development, point you were making. So if there's a strong commitment to development, then we will drive these ambitions forward. And Malaria No More has been good at doing that.
Thank you. Did you want to?
No.
Yes, you.
Yes, me. So I'm just a normal voter. So I completely agree with everything you've said, both of you, and it's very refreshing to be in a room where you don't have to keep making those points to people who don't get it. I'm just wondering if there's anything we can do in conjunction with the Chinese in Africa, given that they have completely, most African countries have mortgaged themselves to China and have got such enormous debts to them now that they might never get themselves out. Is there anything we can do to either work with them or redress the balance?
So thank you very much. I mean, one of the things people say, well, Tories aren't really interested in international development. And I say, if you go to the average Conservative association, you'll find that the branch chairman is involved in Oxfam, or is involved in Christian Aid, or is involved in Water Aid, or something like that. So I think one can depress oneself too much about that aspect. But your main question about the Chinese. The Chinese, you can either be glass half full or glass half empty about the Chinese in Africa. And when I was the development secretary, I used to say to ambassadors, I want to meet your Chinese counterpart. And we had a very good meeting with the chap who was his counterpart in Kinshasa, and as a result of that, we did some joint stuff on infrastructure together. It worked quite well. The problem with the Chinese is the lack of transparency. It's the brown envelopes. It's the fact that they're not open about it. And I used to say to them, if you go on being untransparent, then someone else will come along and eat your lunch. And countries in Africa have begun to realise there's a cost to Chinese doing business with the Chinese. And indeed, it's not in Africa, but in Sri Lanka, because they've defaulted, they've taken a port off them. So there's that negativity. But on the other hand, if you now travel from the airport into Nairobi, the Chinese have built a brilliant road, and it's taken ages off the journey. So it's a mixed picture. But the point I always make to people who and to the Chinese is transparency in the end is in your interests as well. And we were going to take this forward a bit, but unfortunately Rishi called an early election, so that particular initiative was not able to be pursued.
Thank you. Did you?
I would just add that development is something that the UK does really well and could be really proud of. And I think we talk a lot about values and which values we want shaping the world. I think if we withdraw, if we walk away from that historic leadership role that we've had, particularly on international development, we can't be surprised when other countries who don't share our values, or all our values, step in. And we can't compete with China on money, but we can compete in some areas, and we certainly ought to.
Yes.
Hi Andrea, my name is William Womi. I'm the Young Ambassador to the Commonwealth. So it's very interesting that you mentioned Chogam. I was there in Rwanda 2 years ago when President Kagame spoke about malaria and some of the other sort of projects that the Commonwealth really wanted to take. My question is in relation to how are we going to build secure and resilient supply chains in the wake of Brexit, and what is our relationship with the Commonwealth and other sort of international organisations?
Well, supply chains. I don't know whether you're asking me a technical question or not, but supply chains. I don't think I'm not particularly focused on that. You might want to say a bit more about that, but in terms of the Commonwealth, I do think there's a real opportunity now with our new King as the head of the Commonwealth. There's going to be a new Secretary General at Samoa imminently. This is an important opportunity for a restart, and I think the Commonwealth tends to punch below its weight. It's an extraordinary organisation, and it is a north-south organisation. When the Commonwealth focuses on something of value and does it, it affects an enormous number of people. So I think the King too has an ambition for the Commonwealth that it should do more to build community enterprise and do more to tackle climate change and so on. And all of that is very good. So I hope that there is an opportunity for a reinvigoration because of the new King and the new Secretary General at Samoa and following Samoa.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. Okay, we'll take these two and then we'll finish here and there.
Andrew, David Wassell from IPPR. Just wondered whether you could give us any sense of how likely you think it is that whoever emerges from the leadership contest that your party is now enjoying, I suppose is the word, will share the views that you hold on international development. And if I might follow up, whether also how likely do you think it is that whoever emerges from that will actually be the next Tory Prime Minister, or do you think we're likely to face a series of leadership changes before you win the next election?
You can tell he's a former distinguished journalist. So on your second point, I don't know who the right leader is, which is why I'm going to listen with such rapt attention on Wednesday. But I have before, in 2005, gone to a Tory party conference as the campaign manager for the avowed likely future winner, and left it 4 days later with us being the underdog. So I do think it's very important that the conference has a really good look at the four candidates, and that way we will ensure that the next Tory leader is also the next Tory Prime Minister after the next election, because if the Labour government goes on as they are at the moment, I very much doubt they will get a second term. So that's my answer to your tricky second question. On the first question, I think the environment the more difficult the economy is, the more difficult the environment is for development, because it is quote unquote sending money overseas. But under David Cameron, with all the austerity, not only did we sign up to and deliver the 0.7, which was terrific, but also we carried a lot of people with us. And remember, in the House of Commons, there were only 4 people, I think, voted against the 0.7 legislation when it was put through into law. So these things go in phases and tides, and I don't think really about that point about how good or bad they will be on these issues. I think those of us who care about these issues need to make sure that they understand the importance we attach to them.
Thank you. Final question.
So child mortality has dropped significantly over the last couple of decades. We've seen an incredible increase in life expectancy, particularly in Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa. However, as a partial consequence of this, we are also seeing a population explosion and continued population growth in these areas. Now, if we look at the lack of growth, particularly over the last 10 years, demand for aid appears to be expanding faster than GDP in many of the developed countries we see. Previously, we thought 0.7% could cover it. What do you see with the development of pressures due to population explosion, particularly in Africa? Because we know most of the rest of the world, we don't see the same level of population growth.
Well, firstly, the population is increasing significantly in some parts of the world, but not in other parts of the world. One shouldn't forget that. It's an important aspect of this. Secondly, the great discovery that Bill Gates made, and which he then trumpeted, was that if you feed people so they survive, it doesn't put the population up, it takes the population down. And the thing that we did in 2012, and it's been done subsequently as well, is we set up this great family planning annual, it was a meeting. We wanted to have one meeting a year which showed the public, the taxpaying public, why their money was so well spent. And the first time we did vaccinating children under 5, which is a fantastic way of helping. And the second time, and that got 83% support from the British public, by the way, that aspect of development, vaccinating children under 5 in the poor world. And then the second one was the family planning clinic. And had we stuck with the family planning plan, it meant that by 2020 we would have reduced the unmet need for family planning by nearly 50% in the poor world. And if you take a country like Mali at that stage, where contraceptive prevalence was very low, the number of women who wanted access to contraception was vastly in excess than that was being met. And also the fact that this was an economically insecure, a environmentally insecure, climate insecure, politically insecure country, as we subsequently saw, and the population was rocketing, wiping out any economic gain from growth and so forth. You see the scale of the problem, and that's why we took the view in Britain that by bringing everyone together, we could make a real impact on ensuring that unmet need for contraception was met. And it was a great success, and that's what we should focus on. We should focus on giving women the right, if you're addressing population, giving women the right to make up their own minds for themselves, whether and when they have children. And that, in my view, is what we should be doing. We've done it, there's been some successes on that, but you are right that in some of the poorest parts of the world, there continues to be the highest rise in population, which is then an enormous strain on the basic commodities of life for helping people.
Just on the question, if I may quickly, on the leadership, my organisation has to be absolutely neutral, but I would just leave you with this random fact. To the best of my knowledge, only one of the leadership candidates voted to return 0.7 and broke the whip when the vote was held a few years ago, and his name begins with Tom.
Thank you both so much for a really fascinating 50 minutes. Just everyone join me please in saying thank you to our speakers.